I thought I would do just a quick tutorial for the shadows for anybody that might need a review of that. I'm starting with this file. We looked at this before. I pasted this tree in here, and it's on its own separate layer. So if I get the move tool, I can move it around. There it is. So I'll place it in the center, and the process for making a shadow from this tree is pretty straightforward, just a few steps. The first step, let me rename this tree so we can keep track of this. I'm going to make a new copy of that layer by dragging on the new layer icon. And then I'll change that from tree copy to tree shadow. Now, when I'm done, I'm going to move this below, but so you can see what I'm doing, I'm going to leave that layer actually above the tree layer. So first step, most important step, I am going to lock the transparent pixels. And you can see here we can lock the image pixels, position, everything. I'm going to click on this one. Now what that does is it means that if I want to paint, I get a brush here, let's make it a little bigger. I can start out here and paint all I want, nothing's going to happen. As soon as I come across this tree, it will allow me to paint wherever there's already colored pixels, but wherever there are transparent pixels, it locks those out. So instead of trying to paint over this, which I could do, I'm going to use my eyedropper tool and move into the shadow down here and pick some type of dark green up. That's pretty dark green there. Since I'm out in the sun a little more, maybe I don't need it quite that dark, but I can always adjust it later. So let's pick that one for starters. All right, so I have a color, my foreground color. I have my tree shadow layer with the transparent pixels locked. And now I am going to go to the edit menu and choose fill. And as you've seen already, we can use a lot of different fills. I'm just going to choose foreground color. And there you go. It takes the silhouette of that tree and just fills it in with one monochromatic color. Now, in order to see how this works a little bit, the second thing I'm going to do is change that to a multiplied layer mode. And what you see is that actually causes it to be kind of transparent, but it intensifies all the dark tones below there. And I probably will bump the opacity down, and you'll see why in a little bit. But I'll leave it up so you can see what I'm doing. Okay, so I have the tree shadow, transparent pixels are locked, and now I'm ready to do a transformation. So we go to Edit, Free Transform, Control T. Again, the shortcut I want you to remember, or just go to Transform and choose Distort. So now I can grab this part of this layer. I'm just getting a little handle there, and I'm just flattening it down on the ground plane. Now that in and of itself works pretty well, but the shadow, like the tree, is going to be in perspective. So I need to adjust these back edges so they're converging to the vanishing point. And since I don't really have that on here, I'm going to use the grass mow line. So if I had a vanishing point on the horizon line, this is about where it would be. And I can always move the whole thing or grab that and stretch it back a little bit. As I mentioned in class, the word of caution is that you don't want to make the shadow too deep. We're assuming there's a fairly high sun angle, and so the shadow is going to be cast below the tree. We don't really want to stretch it way out in perspective. But if you wanted to make it a little bigger, you could stretch that back a little more, stretch that back a little more. Again, trying to keep these lines pretty much in the perspective of the photograph. Okay, so when I have that done, I'm just going to click OK or the check mark, and you can see now my trunk isn't quite lined up, so I'm going to move that back. And now is when I'm going to take my tree shadow layer and drop it below my tree layer, so that shadow comes out behind the tree. And because the tree is kind of an open organic form and there's light passing through gaps in the leaves, I probably will come up here and adjust the opacity down a bit more. The shadow in the foreground is very dense because it's being cast by an architectural structure. There's no light passing through that structure. It's blocking everything out. The tree isn't the same. So this shadow out here ought to be a little bit lighter than the shadow up against the building here in the foreground. So once I've got that done, that's the shadow. And you can do the same thing with umbrella table and chairs or a bench. It's just that you do have to be careful. The bench, once you start doing something that has more complex three-dimensional form like this bench here, the shadows aren't going to come off of each leg perfectly. There's no way you can make that happen. So for the purposes of photo montage, particularly if it's in the middle ground to background, you can just use this method, fold it down onto the ground, set the layer mode to multiply and the opacity to maybe 50%, and that will be good enough. And again, I could have painted this on here in a similar fashion, but you can see it does create little gaps in it from the open spaces in the canopy here, and a nice feathered edge. If you feel like the shadow is a little too dense, you can always go to the filter, to blur, and to Gaussian blur. We'll talk about some more of these different options for blurring things later, but what that does is if I zoom out, get my tree in the center, zoom in on that a little bit, you can see if I adjust this up, it's going to start blurring those edges. Actually, probably isn't here. What I probably need to do now is unlock the transparent pixels because it's not going to let me blur them into there. So let's go to blur, Gaussian blur, and now you can see it applying that effect. And the more I pull this over, the fuzzier it gets. So I don't want it too fuzzy, but shadows actually do get a little more dispersed and a little softer on the edges the farther it is from where the edge that's casting the shadow is located. So the building, again, it's going to have a more crisp shadow because it's a hard architectural element. Remember, these leaves are moving around, they're overlapping. It's not that hard of a structure. So anyway, that's the basic method. You make a copy of the tree layer itself, lock the transparent pixels, fill it with a dark green color. Now, one thing to remember is on the grass, the shadow is green. If it were cast on this stone capstone on the wall, it would be a darker hue, a darker value of that same hue. Okay, shadows aren't one monochromatic color. They are simply a darker value of whatever surface they fall on. So you might have to make this shadow in one step like this, but if you have paving under there, and then you have some of it on the lawn, you can just select the part that's on the lawn and do a color adjustment. So let's say, for example, that I had some paving that was running through here. So let's say this was gray over here. Now my green shadow wouldn't look very good, but I can go into my adjustments, hue saturation. I can adjust the saturation down. I could even colorize it and just really make it a neutral. Let's say it was a brown paving or something. Drop the saturation out of it a bit. Click OK, deselect that. So if I had some brick pavers under there, I would simply adjust the color of that to reflect a darker value of that same color. So you can see that kind of an effect back here. So anyway, there's a quick tutorial on how to create shadows from elements that you bring into your photomontage.